Welcome back to the ChessGoals YouTube channel. In this video, we're going to look at the Caro-Kann Advance Botvinnik-Carls Defense with 4f4. I recently made a video on 5f4 after white plays c3, which would be from chapter 1 of the ChessGoals Caro-Kann course. In chapter 2 of our course, we look at lines where white does not play 4c3. So let's jump into the game. We have e4, c6, d4, d5, e5, c5. So this is called the Botvinnik-Carls defense. This is what we recommend in our Caro-Kann course. And chapter 1 would be c3. Chapter 2 is every other move for white. And in this line, we're going to look at pawn to f4. It's a bit shaky, but it's a common move and it's not too bad. The downside of f4 is it does weaken these dark squares around the white king. So that's something we want to look to take advantage of. The upside to f4 is it can sometimes create a kingside attack if that pawn comes up to f5, and it can also strengthen the e5 pawn by having another pawn defending it. So if d4 gets captured later, f4 will defend e5. So how do we counter this move? We recommend c takes d4 at this point, and the reason we like c takes d4 is because there's no way for white to capture this pawn back with a pawn. White would love to have this c2 pawn sitting on d4, but it's not going to be easy because if this pawn ever pushes to c3, we're most likely going to take it, and then we'll have a passed d pawn. So take right away, c takes d4. This also helps weaken the dark squares around the white king. So if you look at this diagonal, we would love to have our queen out here pointing down the diagonal, maybe our bishop out here pointing onto the same diagonal. That's something to think about long term. Can we attack the dark squares around the white king? So at this point, the main move we're going to look at and what we look at in the course is knight to f3. But I'd like to also show what happens if white plays queen takes d4 here, because a lot of players are going to take this pawn back right away. The queen's vulnerable on d4 though, so we can kick her with knight to c6. And the strongest move for white here is to retreat the queen, probably to f2. Queen to d2 is also pretty good. Queen to d3, queen to d1. White needs to retreat the queen here. A very tempting move, though, is bishop to b5. And one thing we like to do with the ChessGoals courses is we like to look at moves that are common at the club level, and especially when they're mistakes, because then we can show how to punish those mistakes or take advantage of them. This is a tempting move, bishop to b5, hitting the knight to the king. Here we can play pawn to a6. And the problem is, once the bishop is out on b5, pinning the knight, and a6 is played, you really don't have the chance to retreat the bishop because of knight takes queen. And bishop to a4 can be met with pawn to b5, knight takes queen coming up. So at this point, white pretty much has to take on c6. But what happens here is we have this imbalance where we have the bishop pair against a bishop and knight. And there's really no counterplay for white. So we just get this nice bishop pair advantage, and we have a good pawn center. Pawn's on d5, pawn on c6. This pawn will be on e6 soon. Plans for us are going to be e6, knight h6, maybe rook to b8, pressuring the b2 pawn. The knight from h6 could go to f5 or g4, right? So there's a lot of play here. We still have this exposed dark square diagonal. I think black is already up maybe half a pawn to a pawn, according to Stockfish. So queen takes d4 on move 5 right here. Not the best move, but it's very tempting. Okay, let's look at knight to f3. This is what we cover in the course. Our recommendation is bishop to g4. Yeah, and this is a line that has given me a little bit of trouble in terms of memorizing the move order because I on autopilot want to play knight to c6. But that's not the case here. We see this knight out on f3. We want to pin it to the white queen and try to force the queen to capture back on d4. So the most common move at the club level is queen takes d4, which we cover in the course. It's a mistake, and we're going to look at that next. But let's look at a stronger move for white. We'll actually look at two moves here. Let's look at bishop to e2 and bishop to b5 check. So we'll start with bishop to e2. Here we can capture the knight on f3. And I know what you're thinking, Matt, you just talked about having the bishop pair. Why are we giving up the bishop pair to white? It's because after bishop takes f3, we can play knight c6, holding on to this pawn, and there's actually no way that white can win the pawn back by force. So for example, here's how the line could continue. Castle by white, e6, knight to d2, bishop to c5. So now we have this pawn defended twice. Knight to b3, attacking it twice, but we can drop that bishop back. And now white's got to be thinking d3 could be coming with a discovered check, which gives black the option of trading off that pawn. So a move like king h1 makes sense. But now black can play knight to e7. And what I like about this position is everything is solid. We have this nice pawn chain, the knights are solid, the bishop is safe, and we have this pawn on d4 well defended by knight and bishop. This knight could potentially come to f5 to bring another defender if needed. And I think white is kind of grasping for counterplay here. It's most likely that white's going to try something like pawn to c3, trade off these pawns, and then get this bishop active somewhere. I don't even know how. Bishop e3 is currently guarded. So maybe white's going for f5 at some point. Nevertheless, this is still a very nice position for black. So back to bishop g4. Let's now look at bishop to b5 check. It's always tempting, throw in a check. We can play knight c6, which is where we want the knight anyways. And if white castles here, we could play queen to b6, hitting the bishop, lining up with the white king. And this kind of highlights this dark square weakness that playing pawn to f4 created for white. That pawn on f4 cannot move backwards. And because this diagonal is open up to the white king, this creates some tactical issues for white. And now pretty much white needs to take on c6. That's the strongest move, because a move like bishop to d3 just kind of leaves white's pieces cramped. Like, how do they get that c1 bishop into the game? How do they get the b1 knight into the game? This d4 pawn is really doing a great job controlling those white minor pieces. So both bishop to e2 and bishop to b5 check in this position are tempting moves. They're pretty good moves. The strongest reply, though, which I think is really hard to see, is knight b to d2. And in this case, we can just develop around it with starting with e6. All right, now let's look at the most common move for white, which is a mistake. Queen takes d4. This is what we cover in the course. You have to remember here, when the queen comes out to d4, this knight is only guarded by a pawn. So we can snap the knight off, doubling these pawns, exposing this king even more, right? There's no pawn on g2, no pawn on f2. And here we can play pawn to e6, setting up this threat of knight to c6. This knight later on is going to come out to f5. We could bring our bishop out and our queen out and try to get on the dark diagonal that we talked about. So very comfortable plans for black. Now a common mistake is bishop to e3, which runs into our knight to c6. And here we're going to show you what can happen if white falls into a little trap. Bishop to b5, that's a good move, pinning the knight. We can reinforce with knight to e7. And now let's say white plays knight to c3. Looks logical, trying to get castle queenside, and probably going for a kingside attack, hoping that our king ends up on g8. Right, so white has all their pieces out except the rooks, queenside castle, and then they want to bring the attack. We have a really strong move here. Go ahead and pause the video if you want to try to find it for yourself. The move that wins a piece is pawn to a6. This wins a piece by force, because this knight attacks the queen, so the bishop cannot go back due to b5, and it can't go back this way because of knight takes queen. If takes, we take. This queen has to retreat somewhere. And now we play pawn to d4, forking bishop and knight. It's defended by our knight and queen, so white can't win the d-pawn. And queenside castling doesn't help because we still win a piece, and it's queen lined up with queen, so it's not like they have rook takes our queen, for example. This is going to fork the knight and bishop, pawn to d4, and we're already up a piece. This should be a pretty easy win going forward. All right, so I hope you guys liked this chapter preview, this in-depth analysis on move 4, f4. What I'm going to do, I'll put a link to a video up above, which is the preview, our official preview of chapter 2 of the ChessGoals Caro-Kann course. So feel free to check that out next. And we really appreciate it if you guys tell your friends about the ChessGoals YouTube channel. We're still a small channel, kind of looking to grow. And please like the video, subscribe if you're not a subscriber, and leave a comment down below. We answer and read all of the comments. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.